This is an important life skill that I want to talk about today, and also a life skill that could potentially save your dog's life. So, the life skill that I want to talk about, and every dog that I work with, this is something that I absolutely make sure that we teach them and we are positively reinforcing and checking their understanding of it. So, I want to talk about the behavior of teaching your dog how to wait. So first of all, let's talk about the difference between wait and stay. There is sometimes some confusion, and sometimes the verbal cues of wait and stay are used interchangeably, and that can cause a lot of confusion for your dogs because we only want to have one verbal cue for each behavior. So we don't necessarily want to use wait and stay because our dogs don't necessarily have the understanding that the verbal cue of wait and the verbal cue of stay mean the same thing. So what exactly does wait mean? So wait is more of a temporary pause and creating a boundary before you hear your release cue in order to cross that boundary. So this can be things like patience skills and boundary training. So this can be waiting until they hear the release cue for their food bowl, waiting to cross the street, waiting to go through a boundary such as a doorway, waiting to get out of the car. Waiting to get out of the car is huge, you guys. I really highly recommend that you teach this. And so conversely, what does stay mean? So stay is more of a long-term placement cue. Remain here in this position until I come back and release you. So while there are some differences between wait and stay, there are some similarities, which I think is why that can cause some of the confusion. So the similarities that we see are we can actually use the same hand signal. So for me and the dogs that I work with, I like to use the hand signal of a stop sign. So wait, but you can also do stay. And then you can use the same verbal cue for your release cue. And your verbal cue for your release cue can be whatever you want it to be. Just make sure you're consistent with it. So a lot of people tend to use the word okay, which is totally fine. But okay is one of those words that is used a lot in everyday spoken language and conversation. So sometimes you could, or someone else could accidentally release your dog from doing a current activity if the word okay is said. So you might consider using another word that you don't necessarily use in everyday language. So I don't know, banana, pineapple, apple, anything you can think of as long as you're consistent with it. So again, and this can also be a safety component. So, a lot of times, dogs live in families that have younger kids, and kids are not necessarily the best at maybe shutting a door when they go through it. So the garage door, the front door, or they just open the door and they're not necessarily looking out for the dog. So instead of placing more responsibility on the kids or the sole responsibility on the kids, because we do want to make sure that we are teaching our kids to be responsible around the dogs, but we can also teach our dogs the appropriate behaviors. So the big audacious goal long term would be just because a door happens to open or a gate or something like that does not necessarily mean that the dog is granted access to just automatically running through. So ideally what this would look like is if nobody were around and a door were to open, your dog would not necessarily cross that boundary unless they heard the release cue. But I say necessarily because sometimes dogs can be very opportunistic and they see an opportunity. Ooh, the front door's open. I'm gonna go explore the neighborhood. So they might take it. But this can be really good for building patience, building impulse control, setting boundaries, helping your dogs learn the rules of the household. So circling back to the beginning of the video, asking your dog to wait for their food, asking your dog to wait at a doorway. So a lot of times, not only is this safety for humans, or not only is this safety for dogs, but this can also be safety for humans too, because we don't want our dogs to necessarily be scrambling to get through the door. We want to teach them, hey, can you wait? Can you pause for a beat? Just pause for a second. I will release you through the boundary. I'm just not necessarily ready to have it happen yet. Also, you know, going in and out of dog parks. This is something that I teach as well. But I would say probably the two most important applications for this are waiting at, actually the three most important applications for this are waiting at doorways, waiting before we get out of the car, and also waiting at street corners. So we already talked about waiting at doorways, but we also want to make sure our dogs are waiting in the car, because they have no understanding of the outside situation of what's going on outside of the car. Perhaps we're in a very busy parking lot, or we had to pull off on the side of the road for whatever reason, and then we needed to open the door where our dog was in the back of the car and our dog just hops out. So we do want to teach them, hey, you need to wait a second before I release you. Also street corners as well. So especially if you walk your dog on maybe a little bit of a longer leash, maybe an 8-foot leash or a long line, which those can be 15 to 30 feet or sometimes more. We want to make sure that our dogs are waiting before they cross the street, because we don't want to have our dogs just go blowing past the street corner and right out into the street, because we don't want them to necessarily get hit by a car. So there's many wonderful applications for teaching the behavior of wait, but I just wanted to clear up any confusion of the difference between wait and stay, but also some of the similarities and why this is actually a behavior that we do want to teach our dogs.
So here I'm asking these beautiful girls to patiently wait in the car. We just arrived at the dog park, and I don't want them to immediately jump out of the car to go interact with the other dogs. This boy used to run me over just to get out of the car, but with enough repetition and practice, look at what a good boy he is now. So Olive here is demonstrating what is a pretty thorough and advanced understanding of what we're asking for when we ask our dogs to wait. So in this case, we are asking her to wait at a gate. So we did do a lot of work with this. This didn't happen overnight. It took a lot of repetition and a lot of practice, but as you can see, Olive has a pretty advanced and thorough understanding that she needs to wait at the gate, and just because the gate opens doesn't mean she crosses through. She needs to wait for my release cue. And if she's having a hard time remembering this, a couple things I can do are I can either close the gate to prevent her from moving through it, or I can simply step in front of the gate and block her with my body to help her remember that she does need to wait for that release cue.